So our third snippet from this week is going to look at the first term of the Bush presidency, which will culminate in his reelection, but which is really defined by 9/11. This is Bush at his inauguration. Bush, remember, had campaigned as a compassionate conservative, and in his first few months, there's a kind of veering on this. On the one hand, he cooperates with Democrats in both houses of Congress to pass this law called No Child Left Behind, which increases federal funding for education. Generally a liberal goal, not a conservative goal, in exchange for teachers' lobbies and state education boards agreeing to the increased testing. And so the idea, there's a traditional conservative goal. The idea was to determine whether or not the education was effective. And this is the signing ceremony for the law. You see behind Bush here, Ted Kennedy, the very liberal senator from Massachusetts, George Miller, who was a very liberal congressman from California. So there was a genuine bipartisan a degree of support for this. On the other hand, there was virtually no bipartisan support for this very robust tax cut that Bush pushes through in 2001. He inherits a government surplus from Bill Clinton, very rare in the post-World War II era. Government uses that money to pay down its long-term debt. The argument is that cutting funds will stimulate the economy, will not blow up the deficit. You can see from this chart that's not what happens. And in August of 2001, in response to passage of the tax bill, a Republican senator, very liberal Republican senator from Vermont, named Jim Jeffords, defects from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and that creates a Democratic majority in the Senate. So Bush, even though he had a majority in the House and the Senate was 50-50 after the 2000 elections, suddenly loses that majority. And it's one of these great counterfactuals to imagine how the Bush administration would have developed if 9/11 hadn't occurred, because he then would have been dealing with this Democratic Congress, and the focus would have remained domestic affairs. But that, of course, is not what happens. Instead, we get a the attacks of 9/11. This is Bush at Ground Zero and the aftermath of the attacks. This aggressive response to the attacks, a ceding of power within the administration from the president to the vice president, who really becomes almost the co-president in some ways in the early stages in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And even though the attacks, which were orchestrated by Al Qaeda, with the passive assistance of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, even though the attacks came from Afghanistan, the attacks are used as justification for a U.S. Attack on not just Afghanistan, which I think if Gore had been elected president, Gore would have done the same thing, but also an attack on Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, which did not have a connection to the attacks. And the attacks were justified in a variety of, the attacks on Iraq were justified in a variety of ways. A claim that maybe Saddam did have a connection to 9/11, maybe he was developing weapons of mass destruction, but this decision, the decision to go to war against Iraq, would hover over the remainder of Bush's time in office. That said, support for Bush dramatically increases in the aftermath of 9/11 to almost 90% after the attacks, and it remains very high through 2002 and even 2003 until the war in Iraq starts to go somewhat poorly. Uh, Bush, in this famous photo op after the fall of Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq, proclaims that the mission has been accomplished. The problem was that the U.S. is now stuck in Iraq, that it's an unstable situation, and this photo op will be used by Democrats in the 2004 campaign. In the aftermath of 9/11, the general approach of the Democratic Party was to cooperate with Bush. They could see these approval ratings just as much as anyone else could. And as we get the run up to the 2004 election, most of the leading Democrats had either supported the Iraq War or had in some way supported Bush on national security issues, even though the base of the party was quite anti-war. And into this sort of gap emerged an otherwise very obscure figure, Howard Dean, the Democratic governor of Vermont, a doctor. And his claim to fame previously had been that he had been the sort of moderate, technocratic governor with an emphasis on healthcare. But he says that he wants to run as the candidate representing the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. He says he's a strong opponent of the Iraq War. All of these other people are not. He aggressively raises money online. He's the first presidential candidate to understand how to use the internet to raise money from small donors. He surges to the lead in the Democratic nominating race. He's the red bar on this map. In December and January, he gets the endorsement of Al Gore. It looks as if he's going to win, and then his candidacy kind of collapses. The sense among Democratic establishment types is that Dean is too liberal and too unknown to defeat Bush. In the run-ups to the Iowa caucuses, the second place candidate in Iowa, Dick Gephardt, former congressman, runs these brutal negative ads against Dean. Dean responds in kind. And in the middle comes Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, a war hero from Vietnam who had long served in Ted Kennedy's shadow as a U.S. senator. But the idea among Democratic Party types was that he is the ideal candidate to challenge Bush because he's a military hero, so Bush can't really attack him on national security grounds. Kerry wins Iowa, he wins New Hampshire, and he relatively easily gets the nomination. Problem for the Democrats is that Kerry is this ultimately quite bland figure who had a reputation for being rather wishy-washy. He has this infamous quote where he says he was for the appropriation for the Iraq War before he was against it, and he's describing an accurate legislative process, but he comes across as someone without core beliefs. He's not a terribly gifted speaker. At the 2004 Democratic National Convention, he is wholly outshadowed in terms of speech by the man he chooses as his keynote speaker, the very young and even younger looking compared to what he looks like now, Barack Obama, who had gotten the Democratic nomination for the Senate from Illinois. If you remember Carol Moseley Braun, remember the African-American woman who was elected to the Senate from Illinois with great promise in 1992. Braun loses her re-election bid in 1998. The Republican who defeats her, however, chooses not to run for re-election in 2004, and Obama, in remarkable win, is able to get the nomination and then easily win in the general election as well. So anyone who watches the Democratic convention remembers Obama as this great figure and is kind of nonplussed by Kerry. There was one other real problem with Kerry, is that the rationale for his campaign was the idea that he was someone who could appeal on the security issue to veterans because he was a veteran and he was a war hero, but he was also someone who was hated by a significant component of the veterans community, especially Vietnam-era veterans, because after he returned from Vietnam, Kerry had worked with this organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, had taken some very left-wing positions, had testified that he thought American soldiers had committed war crimes in Vietnam. So there's a contingent of the veteran community for whom Kerry is just the worst imaginable figure. And Kerry, incredibly, even though this enmity within the veterans community had been known for 3 decades, doesn't prepare for attacks from critics in the veterans community. And these are unleashed in this famous cache of ads from a super PAC called Swift Boat Veterans for the Truth, in which you have former Vietnam veterans casting aspersions on Kerry.
If you have any question about what John Kerry's made of, just spend 3 minutes with the men who served with him 30 years.
I served with John Kerry.
I served with John Kerry. John Kerry has not been honest about what happened in Vietnam.
He is lying about his record.
I know John Kerry is lying about his first Purple Heart because I treated him for that injury.
John Kerry lied to get his Bronze Star. I know. I was there. I saw what happened.
His account of what happened and what actually happened are the difference between night and day.
John Kerry has not been honest, and he lacks the capacity to lead.
When the chips were down, you could not count on John Kerry.
John Kerry is is no war hero.
He betrayed all his shipmates. He lied before the Senate.
John Kerry betrayed the men and women he served with in Vietnam.
He dishonored his country. He most certainly did.
I served with John Kerry. John Kerry cannot be trusted.
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
Kerry's response to these ads initially, incredibly, is to do nothing. He says that they're despicable, that they're casting aspersions on his service, that no one could possibly believe them. They're powerful ads. They also the Swift Boat Veterans for the Truth seem to be quite flexible with the truth themselves, but it winds up hurting Kerry, and he sort of falters. He's also hurt in the campaign by another factor. This is a map of the race as it pretty much looked, once the candidates get nominated. Republicans are very strong throughout the South, the Plain states, the Rocky Mountain states. The Democrats are strong in the far West and in the Northeast and in some parts of the Midwest. And there really are very few swing states in 2004. Hawaii is an anomaly here. Hawaii has a tendency to vote for incumbent presidents. They wind up not doing so. But the other 5 states are genuinely swing. New Mexico, which was a much more conservative state than it is now. New Hampshire, where Bush had very narrowly won in 2000. One of the great counterfactuals is that if Al Gore had won New Hampshire in the 2000 election, that he would have been president anyway without winning, regardless of what happened in Florida. And New Hampshire was another state where Nader's vote cost Gore the margin. And then these 3 states in the Midwest, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Iowa, which tended to have disproportionate numbers of non-college educated whites, and also disproportionate numbers of social conservatives, especially in Iowa and Ohio. Social conservatives were very powerful. Bush's advisor, Karl Rove, sees an issue on which to mobilize social conservatives, and that issue is same-sex marriage. And here, Kerry was uniquely vulnerable. Massachusetts is the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. They had done so through a court order, and Kerry typically wraps himself into a pretzel in terms of how to respond to this. He says that he prefers civil unions as kind of second-class government recognition to allowing gays and lesbians to marry. That he doesn't really like the decision by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court that recognized the rights of gay and lesbian couples to marry, but that he also would not support a constitutional amendment in Massachusetts to reverse that decision, and trying to be, to make himself appealing to everyone, he winds up appealing to no one. And even though, if you look at current polling on same-sex marriage, around 2/3 of Americans favor same-sex marriage, and there's no indication that that's going to change. I suspect 20 years from now it will be 3/4, and the numbers are just going to grow. That was not the case in 2004. A majority of Americans oppose the right of gays and lesbians to marry, and those who oppose do so more strongly than those who support. So the Bush team recognizes that if they can get state constitutional amendments, which require a popular vote for ratification, onto the ballot, that might encourage social conservatives to get to the polls. And once they get to the polls, obviously they're going to vote for Bush in favor of over Gore. So all of these states in green are states that have ballot measures to ban same-sex marriage in 2004. The numbers you see on the screen is the final vote in favor of the marriage bans. Every state that has it votes to ban. There are 3 states here that are important. One is Oregon, which now is a pretty reliably Democratic state, but in both 2000 and 2004 was a very closely contested state. The second was Michigan, which Republicans thought they might have a chance of winning. Ultimately, it's not going to be till Trump in 2016. But the third is Ohio. If you go back to this map, the contested state map, Kerry cannot win the election of 2004 without winning Ohio. And Ohio is a state with a strong rural community, very powerful kind of traditional religious community, and the Ohio same-sex marriage ban passes with 61% of the vote. Even more important, what you see are counties in Ohio. What I have here is this is the text that's on the ballot in Ohio in 2004. This very hardline text, comparing gay relations to deviant relationships. One of the things that the Ohio campaign does is it encourages these rural voters who are opposed to same-sex marriage to come out and vote. So in these rural counties, what you see are higher turnouts. So the red counties on this map are counties that are carried by Bush in the 2004 election. The blue counties are counties that were carried by Kerry in the 2004 election. Darker the county, the stronger it voted for either Bush or Kerry. So what you see is that in these rural counties, the percentage of the people who voted, 78, 82, 76, were much higher than in the more Democratic counties, in particular in Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland. Only 68% of the voters turn out to vote. So the measure helps to energize religious conservatives. Bush may have won anyway, but this ensures that he's going to be over the top. He wins Ohio by 50,000 votes, and that's enough to put him with an electoral college majority. You can see the final map here. One of the ironies, we now are in an era where Democrats say the Electoral College is slanted against them, and it was tremendously unfair that Trump won in 2016, even though he lost the popular vote. If there had been a shift in Ohio, if around 30,000 people who voted for Bush in Ohio in 2004 had voted for Kerry, Kerry would have won the Electoral College vote with 271 votes in 2004, even though he would have overwhelmingly lost by about the same margin that Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. So this is a reminder that when you hear talk about Electoral College locks for one party or the other, these things do tend to shift over time. But in any case, Bush has been reelected. It seems like it's going to be a powerful second term. And our last snippet will take a look at what winds up happening in Bush's second term.